The controversial federal order's death row commutations fueled transfers to ADX Florence. The order came down without warning. Inside the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, steel doors slammed shut in rapid sequence. The sound echoed down the range like gunshots. Inmates pressed their faces to narrow windows, trying to understand why the compound had suddenly gone silent. Correctional officers moved fast, boots pounding against concrete, radios crackling with coded messages. A name had just been pulled from the federal death row roster. And he wasn't going to the execution chamber. He was going to the most restrictive prison in America, ADX Florence. The inmate had been waiting for years under a federal death sentence. His case was tied to a high-profile homicide that shocked the country. A jury had once decided he would die for it. But after a wave of controversial federal clemency decisions, dozens of death sentences were commuted to life without parole. No execution date. No final meal. No final words. Instead, a transfer order. That morning, officers were told the Bureau of Prisons had classified him as a national security level risk. The instruction was simple: prepare him for movement to the Supermax in Colorado. Inside the unit, tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. Some inmates cheered quietly. Others went pale. They all knew what ADX meant. 23 hours a day alone. Concrete walls. A slot in the door for food. Silence thick enough to choke on. As restraints were fastened around the inmate's wrists and ankles, he didn't resist. He stared straight ahead. No anger. No relief. Just stillness. But in the control room, a veteran officer muttered something under his breath. "This isn't mercy," he said. "This is a different kind of sentence." Hours later, a convoy rolled out under heavy guard. Engines hummed. Paperwork was signed. The man once scheduled to die was now heading toward a place many call a living tomb. And no one inside Terre Haute knew that this transfer would ignite legal battles, civil rights protests, and fears that the system designed to contain the most dangerous men might be creating something far more unstable. Because what was waiting behind the walls of ADX Florence would test not just the inmate, but the prison itself. And it would start the moment his cell door closed. Before the convoy ever reached Colorado, the inmate's story had already been written into federal court records. Years earlier, he had been convicted in federal court for a calculated homicide tied to a larger criminal operation. Prosecutors argued it was deliberate and brutal. The jury agreed. The sentence: death. He was sent to the federal death row unit at the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, where condemned inmates live in near-constant isolation while appeals stretch on for years. Life there was controlled but predictable. Limited movement. Secured recreation cages. Heavy escort protocols. Every step monitored. Death row inmates were already separated from the general population, but they still had small routines, legal visits, brief recreation periods, distant voices through steel doors. Then federal policy shifted. In 2021, the U.S. Attorney General ordered a review of federal executions. Soon after, multiple federal death sentences were formally commuted to life without parole. The inmate's name was on that list. His execution warrant was voided. The death chamber would never open for him. But the Bureau of Prisons had another plan. Classified as high risk due to the severity of his crime and alleged behavioral concerns, he was redesignated for placement at ADX Florence, the administrative maximum facility, often described as the most secure prison in the United States. ADX was built for inmates considered too dangerous for any other federal facility: terrorists, cartel leaders, prison gang commanders, and inmates who had killed behind bars. The architecture itself was psychological control: soundproof cells, remote-operated steel doors, and concrete beds bolted to the floor. When the transport plane landed in Colorado, the air felt thinner, sharper. The inmate was processed through multiple sally ports, each gate closing before the next opened. No sudden moves. No eye contact with staff longer than necessary. His new cell measured about 7 by 12 feet. A narrow slit of reinforced glass allowed him to see only a patch of sky. As the heavy door sealed with a hydraulic thud, something changed. At Terre Haute, He had been waiting to die. At ADX, he would be waiting forever. And within weeks, the silence would begin to do something no courtroom ever could. The first thing he noticed was the silence. At ADX Florence, silence is not peaceful. It is engineered. The walls are thick concrete. The doors are solid steel. Even the plumbing is designed to prevent inmates from communicating through pipes. Sound does not travel far. Voices disappear into cement. He was placed in a control unit tier, 23 hours a day alone. Meals arrived through a narrow slot in the door. Recreation meant 1 hour in a small, enclosed concrete yard, sometimes called a dog run, with high walls and a metal grate above. No contact with other inmates. No group programs. No physical human interaction beyond restrained escorts and brief exchanges with staff. At first, he followed the routine. He made his bed with military precision. He counted steps from wall to wall. He read legal documents again and again. He marked days on paper with a dull pencil. But time inside ADX does not move normally. Weeks blurred. The narrow window showed only a slice of Colorado sky. He could not see mountains. He could not see another person's face without restraints between them. Some inmates in the facility had been there for years, men like domestic terrorists, international extremists, and high-level gang leaders. The prison was designed to eliminate influence, eliminate organization, eliminate chaos. Yet something else began to surface. Correctional officers reported subtle behavioral shifts. Long periods of motionless staring, talking softly to himself, pacing for hours without rest. These were not rule violations. They were warning signs. Studies and lawsuits over the years had already raised concerns about prolonged solitary confinement and mental health decline in Supermax conditions. Outside the prison walls, civil rights attorneys filed challenges arguing that transferring commuted death row inmates into ADX created a new kind of permanent punishment, one without meaningful review or pathway out. Inside the cell, none of that mattered. One evening, during routine rounds, an officer paused at his door. The inmate was standing inches from the glass, eyes fixed, unblinking. No words. No movement. Just stillness. The officer radioed the lieutenant. Because in a place built to contain the most dangerous men in America, the quiet ones were often the ones who worried staff the most. And this silence was beginning to feel unstable. The incident report was filed at 2:17 a.m. It wasn't a riot. It wasn't an assault. It was something quieter, and in many ways, more unsettling. During overnight rounds inside ADX Florence, an officer noticed water seeping from beneath the inmate's steel door. The unit was supposed to be silent, still, predictable. Instead, there was movement inside the cell. When staff ordered him to step back from the door, there was no response. The response team assembled within minutes. Helmets. Shields. Controlled entry protocol. The heavy door was remotely disengaged, then forced open. Inside, the inmate was standing barefoot on the concrete bed, having flooded the small sink to cover the floor in water. He had wrapped his legal papers in plastic and stacked them carefully in the corner, as if preparing for inspection. His eyes were distant, focused on something no one else could see. Medical and mental health staff were called immediately. There was no weapon, no direct threat. But the behavior marked a sharp break from the rigid routine he had maintained since arrival. He was moved temporarily to a special housing observation cell, still isolated, but under constant camera watch. Notes and internal reports referenced acute psychological strain and extended solitary stress indicators. Outside the prison, lawsuits challenging long-term Supermax confinement continued. Civil rights groups argued that commuting a death sentence only to place inmates in indefinite isolation created what they described as a different form of extreme punishment. Federal officials maintained that ADX placement was based on security risk, not revenge. The inmate never returned to death row. He will never face execution. But he will also likely never leave ADX Florence. Today, he remains in a cell where the light never truly goes dark and the sky is visible only through reinforced glass. His sentence reads life without parole. No release date. No final countdown. For some, the commutation was mercy. For others, it was transformation, from a sentence measured in years to one measured in endless days of silence. And inside America's most secure prison, the debate continues, not in courtrooms, but behind steel doors that close with a final, echoing thud.